Welcome, everyone, to the next interview in the JMU SPCE Leads Speaker Series. SPCE is the School of Professional and Continuing Education. LEADS is an acronym that stands for the Leadership Education and Development Series. And this speaker series is focused on the theme, Thriving in the New Normal, What Leaders Should Know to Lead Innovation in Hybrid and Remote Teams. And we have a very relevant topic here that also leverages one of JMU's really premier centers around ethical reasoning. So ethical reasoning in action is a very robust program, and there's a center, and we have the two leaders of that center here on the interview today. And the focus is going to be how they might use their processes of ethical reasoning applied to the ethical dilemma of monitoring remote workers. We've heard things like you have to leave your Zoom or your video on all day long to make sure that you're working, or measuring keystrokes, or all these sorts of things. And that sounds a little squishy to me of whether something, I know it's not something I'd want to have done to me, but maybe there's other reasons where there's circumstances where that is reasonable to do, or even ethical to do. So how would we work through that? So our guests today are Christian Early and Casey Damati. Would you each take a turn introducing yourselves and fill in the blanks around the center at JMU first before we get into the actual topic?
Sure. Casey, do you want to go first?
Sure. I'm Casey Damati. I'm Assistant Director for Ethical Reasoning and Action. We use ethical reasoning strategy called the 8 key questions to help people figure out how to make better decisions. I am in charge of taking care of our social media. I do student engagement, and I help train for our largest workshop that we partner with orientation called It's Complicated, which is a program that every incoming student, this year we had close to 5,000 incoming students take before they enter the classroom to practice using the 8 key questions. Christian?
Christian Early. I teach philosophy at JMU. I have been teaching philosophy for about 20 years or so. Joined the Ethical Reasoning and Action program 5 years ago, and I've been working in that capacity since then. I'm right now the interim director of Ethical Reasoning and Action. And I think what I would want to say is that in the landscape of higher education, what we do at JMU is really unique. There is no other program quite like it on offer anywhere else. And the main focus is to come up with a strategy for ethical decision-making, and it's built on curiosity, not on principles. And so we have 8 key questions, not 8 key values or principles or laws. And we came up with those 8 key questions simply by analyzing moral language. What do people mention as considerations that are important to them when they talk about making distinctions between right and wrong? And so 8 is a lot, but at least it's less than 10. And so we think we're okay. And we have an acronym that we use for clear. So for clear decision making, and we can say more about.
Yeah, I'll pull that up here in a second. As an introduction, that's great to get us started. And let me just paint the picture for folks that don't see the the reality of what Casey was talking about, which is having 5,000 freshmen going through an ethical reasoning exercise in their first few days of arriving on campus at JMU. Now, when I say this, think about how this might be used in your workplace, what are the ethical dilemmas in a workplace, and what if we practiced ethical reasoning and some of those ethical dilemmas were put in front of your employees and teams, and maybe teams that don't always work together or teams that do work together. And what if you had a way to practice reasoning ethically? And that's what's happening at JMU. Now, the cases at JMU, the one that I facilitated had to do with whether or not Narcan would be distributed and be available on campus. So Narcan helps people resuscitate if they've had an opioid overdose effectively, and can save lives. So now you have all these freshmen thinking about, what are the ethics of that? Are we encouraging opioid use, or by having that available, or are we, how do we prioritize the values here? Really rich discussion. So in our ethics of even running training programs through JMU, there's ethical dilemmas that come up. And we want to focus on one here in this conversation about remote monitoring of remote workers. And the way to do that is through this a key question format. So I'm going to just go ahead and pull those up, and maybe, I'm sure the two of you have lots of practice talking through these. Can you see those there on the share screen?
Yeah.
Okay, so jmu.edu ethical reasoning, that's a place where you can go to see the full center, but I'm going to go through and just highlight these questions here. And which of you would like to take the baton?
Kristen, do you want to?
I can start out. One of the things I guess I want to say is, so we teach the strategy, the asking the questions, and part of that has to do with when we are. I read somewhere that we are estimated to make, I think it was 35,000 decisions in a day.
Wow.
And this is everything from, should I hit the snooze bar and get up in 5 minutes, or should I get up now? It is, what kind of clothes should I wear? What should I put on my bagel? Or, it's all of that. And if you add that up, it's a lot. So what we're doing is teaching a strategy for decision making that are moral. Often what happens is that we recognize a moral situation in hindsight. So what are so when we're asking questions, we start to become attuned to the moral information that is in a situation already. So the key thing is to spot it when you're in it, because then you can do something about it, not when it's in the rear view mirror. So these questions prompt curiosity. And the fairness question helps direct our attention to how we guide behavior with response to fairness. One thing is being able to spot when something unfair happens out in the world. But another thing is how we should act fairly in a situation. So let's say,
let me just orient people to this if they're seeing this for the first time. What I have on the screen are the 8 key questions. That's what you see right here. And each question is aligned with a particular value or perspective. What would you call the things here in purple and bold?
I'd call them considerations.
Okay, so a consideration or a lens. You were just starting to talk about fairness. And you see there's a question associated with that. How can I or we act justly, equitably, and balance legitimate interests in this scenario? Right. So Christian is starting to go through the example of applying one of these questions in a hypothetical. So I'd be curious if you can relate this in how you start describing this into this idea of if a leadership team is thinking about, we need to really monitor remote workers to make sure people are doing things and that we're not paying them or using taxpayer dollars or investors' dollars, and we're not holding people accountable.
Well, one question would be just simply if it's a fairness rule. So with fairness, we are asking about distribution, and if it's good for one, then it's good for the other. So a question I would want to ask is, would you want to be monitored as well?
I can see that. Are we going to monitor everyone? Is the leadership team going to be monitored? Are
That's
the
exactly
employees going to
correct.
be able to see the CEO at her desk also doing this?
That's the fairness question. So again, now these are questions that help us get information about how to guide behavior. So the fairness question, one situation would be that I use to sort of explain it is, let's say you're in a line for pizza, and you're at the back of the line, and there's a person in front of you, and there are 2 pieces of pizza left, and the person in front of you is really hungry, so that person takes them both. Now you're going to probably experience that as unfair, and that again would be fairness directed to the outside. But let's say you're the person who's standing right in front of the person at the back of the line. Fairness guiding behavior would be to say, okay, there are 2 pieces. I'm really hungry, but I should only take 1 piece so that there is enough for everyone. So the question, where the question begins to get a grip on reality and is when it guides behavior. So for monitoring, is would you be willing for that monitoring to happen with everyone, including yourself?
I can see that already putting some water on the idea, or certainly making the decision-making process more robust, even just with that one question. And
That's right.
I think that, gives a sense. Now, you mentioned the acronym before, so you mentioned 4 clear. So just how people can read this, you see FOR, fairness, outcomes, responsibilities, and then character, liberty, empathy, authority, and rights. Casey, are these in an order of priority?
No,
What's more
not at
important
all.
than the rest? Okay.
No, not at all. Not at all. It's it can be moved around and refigured however the decision maker sees fit. Oftentimes what we do in workshops when we take this out of JMU is we ask people to complete an ethical preference inventory. Think like BuzzFeed, which hobbit are you type question. This is like a survey that we give so that the person can figure out which of the 8 key questions they tend to lean into more frequently when faced with ethical decisions. So for some people, they lean into outcomes. That's a priority for them. For some people, it's liberty, autonomy, consent. Am I free to act in the way that I want to, or does my decision impede that? So the individual will value an 8 key question maybe higher just by their very own nature. But it's also really scenario dependent too. We don't always value the same 8 key questions in the same way. We wouldn't rank them as individuals when talking about the me, the I, the person. For example, there's something in workplace monitoring that I just learned about recently called geofencing. And what that is it the employer creates a geo fence and basically say, if you're within this radius, it could be a mile to 500 yards, you're technically at work and thus subject to the monitoring, the legal monitoring that's available. So there are all sorts of questions about that when you talk about, well, if my home is within the geo fence, but I'm home, how am I still at work? So there's liberty questions there. There's authority questions there. Who do they have the right to monitor things? So it's a really rich set of questions that we like to say, not beg, Christian's going to give me a figure. They want to generate more questions, right? So if I think about a fairness question, that might cause someone else to think of, well, that impedes on my liberty. So one question can beget another.
Okay. And that I'd love to kind of work through all of these questions just so people that are new to this get oriented to those. But
Yeah.
I really think it's useful to understand what you just said at the beginning, that we may be more prone in our own ethical reasoning to default to one or a couple of these, and maybe have the tendency or habit or preference to use these as a or the lens that we maybe over apply or apply without sensitivity always to the particular scenario. And I'm sure we've dealt with this or maybe been aware of it, but laying them out here in this way really helps identify the various lenses. Christian, maybe you could talk, or go ahead.
I was going to say, we can read through them. The one thing that I wanted to mention too, this isn't done in isolation. This framework and this strategy works best when you're in diverse groups. So you can think about the 8 key questions for yourself. That's certainly a key part of it. But the richness of the discussion, of the conversation, comes from having different diverse perspectives.
Great. Christian, could you maybe give your example for outcomes and responsibilities?
Sure. So we distinguish with in outcomes, looking at short-term and long-term outcomes. And so when you make decisions that are short-term, you are looking for, you might say, an immediate payout. But the problem is that if you only go for immediate payout, then you miss the opportunities for investment, where you take, let's say, a short-term hit for a long-term payout. And when you change the depth of focus from short-term to long-term, there are different kinds of decisions that begin to be prioritized for you. So I can imagine, for example, a short-term outcome is, let's say you get more compliance if you have more monitoring. But a long-term outcome may be that the culture of the workplace starts to change. Maybe you start having conversations where workers feel unsatisfied about being constantly watched. And so when you're thinking about outcomes, it's not just short-term, but it's also these long-term things that you have to pay attention to. I was recently made aware of a distinction between finite and infinite games. A finite game is like tennis, where you have a winner and it sort of ends. And there is a way to play tennis where you're winning, but there's also a way to play tennis where it's the fun of playing and you keep playing because you want to play. That has the quality of an infinite game. You do something, the way in which you play the game is for the game itself, so the game can keep going. And so when you're thinking about company culture, it may be a short-term win for a monitoring, but it may be a long-term loss if you lose the character. Here I'm invoking another of the key questions, but if you lose the atmosphere of the company. So now the 8 key questions are not you should one and you shouldn't the other. The 8 key questions are designed to get you more information so that you can make a better decision.
Great. I'm going to stop the share, but anybody watching this, I'll go ahead and be reading these questions as we go through. But the outcomes question is, what possible actions achieve the best short and long-term outcomes for me and all others? And then the next one, responsibilities, says, what duties and or obligations apply? So in the case of remote work monitoring, and if a leadership team is deciding whether that's ethical to do, are there instances where there are duties or obligations that actually could necessitate doing this, or necessitate not doing this?
Or policy that gets laid out about it. Policy is a huge thing because there are legalities in play, which is a rights question. But when companies form these monitoring policies, the pandemic really caused people to make quick decisions. There wasn't really a lot of time. People had to go remote. And a lot of companies that thought they were going to die if they went work from home prior to the pandemic discovered that that wasn't the case. And so they sort of had to backtrack in how they were going to endeavor in this new sort of workplace area. And so a lot of companies have policies in place for workplace monitoring, but they're not clear. It's not as specific. And so one question that comes up is, are employees or are companies responsible for laying out clear policies, or are the policies that exist, is that enough? Have they fulfilled their responsibilities by laying out these vaguer policies? So it's also another question of responsibility in workplace monitoring is, what is the responsibility of the employee to be subject to that monitoring? Do they have a responsibility to agree to that? Is that the decision whether they're fired or not? Or is there a level of privacy here that the employee is responsible for maintaining?
Yeah, this seems pretty at the core of it, and in a lot of ways, I could see a manager or leader saying, I have a responsibility to make sure that my followers, my employees, are working.
That's right.
And how am I going to do that if I can't see them? And so I am actually acting consistent with my responsibilities and my role as an organization to implement policies to make sure that I can fulfill my responsibility and duty as manager of X team or CEO of whatever, to make sure that I'm investing the resources of our taxpayers, potentially, in investors, being a steward of a nonprofit, for example, donors, am I managing a situation responsibly? So, of course, that's not the only responsibility or duty as well. I guess, is that part of the impact of this question?
That what Casey mentioned, the responsibility of transparency and to articulate exactly what it is you're being monitored and what you're being held responsible to do. Are you responsible to get the work done on time, or are you responsible to sit in front of the monitor for 8 hours? And how are we understanding the monitoring? What is it exactly that we're monitoring? And how is it not an encroachment on privacy?
I see what you're saying. We just released an interview in the series about VUCA, and with the director of a film called It's VUCA. And VUCA is an acronym that the military uses to describe the environment that they're operating in, and that more and more is relevant to us: volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous. And there is also a positive VUCA framework where leaders are responsible for a VUCA that you can watch the interview and read about. But this seems to be another way to navigate that VUCA environment, and understanding that it is not clear, it is complex, it's ambiguous, and uncertain. So that's a connection that I'm making here within the series. But perhaps we move on to character. The character question is, what actions help me or us become my or our ideal self? So what actions can help us or our organization become our ideal self?
Do you want to take that one, Casey?
Yeah, it's a heavy question. Oftentimes we think about this as a personal, who am I? Who are they? How does this decision reflect who I want to be, my ideal? But it's definitely about workplace culture and the identity of an institution as well. And so when we talk about making these decisions about workplace monitoring, Christian mentioned it earlier, creating a culture, thinking about your responsibility for transparency, the fairness, is everyone being monitored, the outcomes, what happens if I monitor Slack? These all sort of contribute to the character of the institution, the character of the leader, the character of the decision maker. So another perspective is how everything is integrated right now. And this is something I just recently noticed. So if you use your Google profile on your home desktop, but then you also use it, and when I say Google, like your Gmail account that now interfaces with your web browser, your Gmail, your docs, your slides, your sheets, that web history, even though my web history on my computer, I can search for whatever I want on my computer, that web history shows up in my browser on my laptop. So I have to create a whole different user identity because I'm concerned about my character at work. And if IT gets a hold of my computer and for some reason they want to look, or FOIA, those searches didn't happen while I was on my computer, but they happened at home. So
FOIA,
there's a
just jargon alert.
Oh, right.
If you're
Sorry.
not in the public world, FOIA is Freedom
Right.
of Information Act requests. So we're at a state institution, so that's why that would be relevant in our scenario.
So I think about, okay, I'm not searching about it on my computer, on my work laptop, but I'm searching whatever random fun things I'm searching on my home computer, but they're showing up in my history on my work laptop. So what does that say something about me to my employers? Are they watching? If a policy isn't laid out, how do I know where the line is?
Yeah. So this strikes me as a little bit different than the example where you're saying, like, maybe remote work monitoring policies just don't exist or are ambiguous or are not clear. I could imagine many organizations had never entertained it at all and didn't have anything. Where with the character piece, there may be some artifacts out there that describe their ideal selves. It could be their values. It could be their vision statement. Maybe the HR department has its own mission statement and its own goals. So that seems like potentially for some organizations that have gotten that far as a reference point,
Right.
where they've maybe identified a version of what their ideal self would be. So maybe Christian, could we go to Liberty?
Yeah. Just to tag on with character, is the idea is how we act is who we become. And so when you're thinking about who do we want to be as an organization, and then what kinds of decisions will get us closer to that ideal for us. Again, the idea there is to help it guide decision making in your reflection.
Yeah.
So for
the Liberty question is, how do we show respect for personal freedom, autonomy, and consent?
That's right. None of us like it when other people make decisions for us that we didn't agree with or consent to. When we've been in a situation where we say, I didn't agree to that, and yet someone decided that for us, we experience our liberty having been violated. And so how do you turn that into a guidance question? Well, how do you act in such a way that you respect the autonomy, the choices, the freedom of choice of other people? I love it when I am given a choice in the matter. When someone respects me enough to say, we should ask what Christian thinks about that, and not just decide without consulting or without bringing that in. So one question that we would have here with workplace monitoring is, well, what would your employees say about that? Do they have a choice in the matter? Can they be brought into the decision making? Is this something that they would accept or might have objections to? And those objections could be very legitimate concerns. But the problem is that if you don't bring that into the decision making, you're just in your own isolated perspective. And so it's really about respecting the choice and freedom of others, and you're bringing that into the decision making.
It's interesting. It reminds me of a lesson that we teach in our Foundations of Project Management class and our Lean Six Sigma Greenbelt class, which sounds very technical and not something out of the Department of Philosophy, but it's the 5 whys. It's a very common approach for problem identification. And we've been talking about this in the context of reviewing one potential solution to a problem or a challenge. So the challenge is, how do managers and leaders know that their workers are working when they can't see them? And the solution over here is remote work monitoring, which can show up as have your camera on all day long at your desk. So that's the solution. So these questions seem to evaluate the solution, and by themselves don't necessarily force you to reconsider that solution and come up with different solutions. But that almost seems a byproduct of going through it. It's like, oh, well, maybe that's not the only way we could do this. Maybe the camera isn't the only way. Maybe there's other options, or maybe there's other things. So I'm reflecting on that, on the impact and actual tool of how these 8 key questions are applied.
That's right. And that's I think a natural thing that we do is we start once we start to realize, wait a second, this is kind of problematic. We start to readjust our imagination and thinking about, well, what is something that people could agree to? Is there something that we could all say, you know what, this is reasonable? Or what, you know, I don't want to come up with the solution, because the point here is the process.
Yeah. So empathy, the empathy question says, how would we act if we cared about all involved? Casey, how would you describe that? Seems loaded.
So empathy is a big one for me. This is my top key question in my ethical preference inventory. Empathy means that you are not seeing your company in this discussion. You're not seeing your employees as numbers. You're not seeing the data that they put forth as output. You're seeing them as humans. And if you can make decisions and put them in a place that humanizes them, and you can care about the outcomes, you can care about whether they're treated fairly, you can care about your character and their character and the decisions that you make and how it impacts them. If you lead with that, then you're going to make better decisions. For example, there's a program called Terramend, and it can scan emails for signs of disgruntled employees by flagging like things like profanity in emails, or visits to job search sites, or negative posts on social media. So this skirts the line of privacy, and empathy would ask, well, how would I feel if this was being done to my best friend, or if I really truly cared about this person and their right to privacy, or their freedom to have a social media account that reflects authentically their character and who they are, and not have that impact their work environment, or be subject to the crawling of the app, scanning for these things, because tone doesn't translate on social media. You can make a sarcastic tweet, and if this program scans it and flags you, well, then you've got a problem. Now you have a discussion, you have time in with HR, you have to explain, and And so empathy, leading with empathy would cause people to say, well, how can I see it from their perspective? An employee would then have to go, what you were talking about with responsibilities. What if I were in that position making those decisions and these were people that I worked closely with? How would I act if this was my team and not something that I was subject to? So it's putting yourself on a level of understanding with the people who are making decisions and before you make a decision.
Yeah, I could see it also, some of these questions guiding not just what is the decision, but how do we get there? What are the things that we need to do in the process to accommodate these different concerns? And while in this interview, we are focusing on particularly remote worker monitoring, these same questions could be applied to the broader conversation in the series, which is, what is our remote and hybrid work policy? Should we have people come in and out on the same day? What day? And all those sorts of things. So let me throw out the next one here. And Christian, if you want to add in your thoughts on empathy, feel free, but I'll go ahead and read the authority one, which is our seventh key question. What do legitimate authorities expect of us in this situation? So what do legitimate authorities like experts, the law, my religion, what do those things dictate should be done?
Well, so you were mentioning policies, and this is actually where we have where we do policy work. Policy functions in the 8 key question strategy. Policy is an authority, but there's another way to think about authority. There is where should we go for guidance? And I can imagine that there may have been studies done on what workplace monitoring, what are best practices, not just what are monitoring softwares out there, but maybe some studies on what actually happens if you implement this policy versus that policy. And maybe there's a way to get some empirical data on what happens in organizations as a result of workplace monitoring. That would be an authority if you go to an expert or expertise in the matter. So when we're asking the question of authority, it is, to whom should we go, or to where should we lean for guidance? And when we're making these sorts of policies, that's the authority question.
That's interesting. You know, I'm thinking about, I default to environments where doing this remote monitoring is just not part of the culture and could be really problematic. But I'm also understand that, you know, our cyber security agencies and our, you know, the NSA, for example, is going to be monitoring and has been monitoring as much as they possibly can for decades about their employees, from probably, I would think, maybe from this authority type of lens of they're accountable for breaches of security. They're accountable for being able to later recreate steps that were taken.
That's true.
And you have to do this in order to be able to fulfill future responsibilities, and it's sort of by dictate in some ways. In some industries, in some sectors, in some particular roles, you just have to.
And so that's brings up a really important point, which is that each situation and each organization and each company may call for a different response, a different choice. Now, the strategy can remain the same, but the eventual decision that gets made probably will be different from organization to organization. And so in some cases, you're really going to need a robust set of monitoring. And in others, you might say, you know what? It really just matters that the work gets done. if someone can do it really quickly in 2 hours and other kinds of jobs maybe take 8 hours, it doesn't actually matter how much you have your eyeballs in front of the screen. What matters is just that when the day is done, the work is done. And so then you have more flexibility. But in other situations, you might not have that flexibility.
Yeah, I think in an instrumentation and measurement lens, you could say, is looking at a grid of Zoom faces working at their computer really the right measure for what it is that we're trying to ensure here? So if what we're trying to ensure is productivity, customer feedback, timely communication, some types of results, maybe there's some other metric over here that is less invasive, less problematic, and more aligned with what you're actually after.
That's right.
That's really evident in sales. Sales is about relationships. It's not about keystrokes. And in I shared with you the podcast from the Globe and the Mail in Canada about laws in Ontario and workplace monitoring. And maybe you can share that link with your listeners as well. But they said in that podcast that keystrokes, the higher the keystrokes for salespeople, the lower their sales were, because salespeople need to be out of the office, selling, building relationships. So that's exactly right.
Yeah, right. What are you going to do for those from the equity standpoint? Put a GoPro on them
that's
and
exactly
have
right.
them go when they go do their sales meetings all around. Last of the 8 key questions is what rights, if any, apply here. So, and then you also distinguish types of rights or categories of rights, of innate rights, legal rights, social rights. So who wants to take that one and apply it to the scenario?
I can.
Yeah, go ahead, Casey.
Well, so the U.S. Equal Employment Opportunity Commission has employee rights that are laid out, what employees have a right to in general. They have a right not to be harassed or discriminated against, to receive equal pay, to receive reasonable accommodations, that their medical or genetic information will be kept confidential, and protection against discrimination. But nowhere in it does it sort of lay out what the employee's rights are to privacy in relation to employee monitoring. Now, the federal, it's a federal law from 1986. The employee, hang on, I lost it here. Oh, the Employee Electronic Communications Privacy Act of 86. That protects business people and employers. So when we talk about rights, what legal rights apply, you're going to ask questions about, well, what are the laws that exist? What does, what are the court decisions? When we talk about innate rights, we talk about that, like we said, that right to privacy. Do I have an innate right to privacy? Is there a social right within the context of the company for someone to be exempt from workplace monitoring? Do they have a right to that? So this is really about what are the rules or laws? What are the things that are laid out that restrict or confine people's actions? So a lot of times people will equate liberty and rights together.
Yeah, I was wondering if you could make that distinction for me.
Yeah, Christian actually is really adept at explaining this. So, Christian, you want to talk about?
Take that one? Thank
I do.
You,
yeah, I do.
So when I think about rights, I think about agreements that we have come to where we're protecting someone or a group from those rights being violated. And when I think about freedom, I'm thinking about respecting someone else's choices. Now, what gets confusing is that in this country, in the tradition of the United States of America, freedom is a right. And so the two are linked, but these 8 key questions are not, they don't privilege a culture or a time in intellectual development or a place. And so there's a way in which someone in Japan or Nigeria or in Ukraine can be asking rights questions, and they would be coming at it from a different tradition, but the sensitivity to rights, the consideration of rights would still be sort of alive from them. And so the 8 key questions are tap into those considerations, but they don't necessarily privilege one culture or perspective.
Well, this is really useful, and I know we could talk about it forever, but I want to transition to how individuals might be able to take advantage of this process. First of all, we just did a quick review of the 8 key questions on one potential topic, and it just, even in our conversation, we could see how it applies to different parts of decisions, different contexts, different personal issues, public issues. We could have a whole conversation probably for a week about the masking issues during the peak of COVID through these questions. So I encourage it as a manager resource to use to walk through scenarios and maybe practice them on ones that aren't real hot right now, but walk through some ones as a team where you're practicing going through this prior to doing it on the issue that's right in front of you right now, to get practice with it. And we have a couple listener thank you gifts that we can share with folks along these lines. But first, I want to give a shameless plug. So you'll have a chance to give a shameless plug, and I will model one. So the shameless plug is that we'd love for you to take some of the trainings available through the School of Professional and Continuing Education. We have a project management and team communications course coming up, which is a entry-level course to learn how to coordinate. I think we might want to add maybe a little ethics lesson in there, so that as teams confront these issues on project teams, maybe we can reference this content. We do have a Lean Six Sigma Green Belt class that goes to problem identifications that incorporates the 5 whys. So I will put those links into the description. And I'm excited that we had a meeting about potentially offering your corporate training version of this via the School of Professional and Continuing Education. So maybe you could talk briefly about what's available for organizations that may want to bring you in to facilitate a session similar to this on maybe a canned issue, a canned ethical issue, or even ones that are common in their workplace. Maybe you could describe what that 3-hour workshop would be like.
Well, we do scenario work where we're practicing the key questions, because what we know is that when you're in the heat of the situation, we tend to rely on our past habits. So it's really critical to practice this, just exactly like you said. And that's what we would do for a workshop. We would take a group or a company or whoever is in the decision-making process. We would work through sort of step by step how to do it, and then gradually sort of increase the heat of the situation so that you get as close to a live experience of that as possible. And the thinking behind it is that has the best chance of making a connection with behavior outside of the workshop.
So if you are interested in that, reach out to me or to Casey or Christian. That is available. Those links will be available under the YouTube video, but also all of the links will be available for those that have signed up for the full speaker series, which is also available at the link below. In terms of listener thank you gifts, we have 2. One is a little 8 key question pack. These are wallet cards. And then Casey, you could maybe talk about some other things that might be in the pack for the first 3 people that email me. If you email me with your address, I will send you the 8 key question ethical reasoning and action swag bag, or whatever we want to call that. And so you can talk about that, Casey.
You'll get a mask, you'll get a sticker, you'll get a way to show everybody that you know how to stay ethical.
Great. The other one is you mentioned a couple times the ethical preference inventory. We talked about where we may default to one or a couple of these. And you have a tool for that people can take for free?
Yeah, we do. It's online. It's epi.questionpro.com.
Wow. So if people take that, it will give them an idea of which one of these considerations they default to. Is that a fair way to put it?
It'll just weigh them. So it's not a perfect science. I said again, I describe it as sort of the BuzzFeed quiz of ethical reasoning. It's questions that are designed and ranked to show which of the 8 key questions you tend to lean in toward most.
That's really exciting. I'm going to take it and encourage others to take it as well. So is there anything else you'd like to share about the center or this approach or what you offer via the center to the general public?
We do have a listserv that we put out ethical scenarios when we have everyone in the office and we're not homesick with kids. The Ethics in Action series has been going on for 1.5 years. And our most recent scenario was on workplace monitoring. Our next one is on proctoring, student proctoring, which comes really closely tied in to our discussion today. There's a lot of forced proctoring that happens on kids' laptops. So if you're interested in that, I'll give you the link to sign up for the Ethics in Action email series, and everyone who's listening can start getting those emails right away. That's great. Christian, any closing words?
No, this has been great. Thank you so much. When I asked my students was this helpful, 90% of them say learning the 8 key questions has been really helpful in everyday life. And then I asked them, have you ever changed the decision that you were going to make as because you used the 8 key questions? And 66% of my students say, this is consistently from semester to semester, they say, yeah, I can think of at least one situation where I chose something different because I used the 8 key questions.
Well, I love this tangible framework for leaders and managers and professionals to think through ethical dilemmas that are related to remote work, hybrid work, but also so many other things that we face on a day-to-day. So it's awesome that JMU has this resource. Thank you for sharing it. And I do hope people take advantage of the opportunity to bring you into the workplace. We will, in the near future, be able to advertise an open enrollment course as well, where individuals can be trained by both of you in an online course format similar to our other offerings. So I hope people stay tuned for that. So with that, thank you very much.
Thanks, guys.
Thank you.